Let's start. We are perfectly on time.
Intanto grazie per la consueta,
First of all, thank you for being here so numerous as usual.
Quando si tratta, confesso che io
Also, well, I was a bit pessimistic, and not because the topic is not interesting, but because it is very complex. That is how it is possible to protect the voting rights in a company. So it's a very complex topic which requires a technical analysis which we will hear from a professor teaching in Harvard and who also taught at the London School of Economics and who has been dealing with theoretical economy for many years, Professor Oliver HART. I'll limit myself to a bit of provocation because it's the voting rights of shareholders and not the protection of shareholders which we're going to discuss. But this is a topic which is nevertheless correlated. And I'd like to say, I'd like to tell you all that at first thing that we can say is that the protection of shareholders in Italy doesn't have a very long tradition, above all when it's small shareholders. We could even say that the Italian legislation protects large shareholders instead of small shareholders. The financial history of Italy, as you may know, is full of negative episodes in terms of protection of shareholders. And then, if you listen to the various debates yesterday and today, for example, the presentation by Professor Guido Rossi or Judge Davigo, well, they spoke about relations between democracy and the market. And the result or the scenario which has been depicted is not very optimistic. So we're really looking forward to the presentation by Professor HART. And perhaps I may mention what Guido Rossi said this morning when he spoke about the various financial instruments, the various shares which are present and which in some cases have already caused some trouble on the market. So, well, we will hear about this complex topic. I just wanted to make a very short introduction and to speak about the protection of shareholders in Italy, hoping that perhaps during the debate after the presentation of Professor HART, there will be the possibility of making comments or asking questions and perhaps ask Professor HART what he thinks about the issue of protection of shareholders. Now the floor to Professor Oliver HART.
Thank you very much. Well, let me begin by saying I was in this room yesterday, a little later. It was very, very hot, and I hope it's a little less hot today. But if you fall asleep, I shall understand, although I'm going to try to stop it happening. So the theme of this conference is markets and democracy, and a lot of activity in market economies takes place within firms. And you can think of firms as being small or mini societies. And like any society, they have to be governed in some way. And that's really the question I'm going to be interested in. How should they be governed? Who should control them? Who should have the voting rights? We're going to sort of concentrate on that question. And there's some natural constituencies of a firm. So if you like, you could say these are the citizens of a firm. They're often called, I don't know, in English, stakeholders. And the people one thinks of, the groups are shareholders or investors. These are the people who hand over their money to the company, and in return they're meant to get a dividend. But it's not a firm promise, it's really a discretionary payment by the firm. Then we have the workers, the people who work in the firm, the consumers, the people who buy the product or products of the firm, suppliers are another group, and then creditors. These are also people who hand over money to the firm, but they are promised something firm in exchange. They're promised a fixed payment, not a discretionary payment. So the first point I want to make is that if we think about democratic principles, it's not obvious how to proceed. Which of these groups should get votes? What's the democratic solution? It's not clear. Should they all get votes? Should some get more votes than others? We don't really know. This is where economics can be helpful. So economists look at this problem in a particular way, and I think their way of looking at it gives you some insights and some guidance. So in particular, the way an economist thinks is as follows, that a vote is useful for a person or group because it gives them some protection against being taken advantage of, and it also allows them to influence events. So, for example, if I have a vote and you're running the company, you're the manager, and you're thinking of doing something, I could, if I'm the only person with the vote, I could stop you. I could say, no, you're not allowed to do that. And that might protect me against some action you're going to take, which might be bad for me. Now, votes, though, are a scarce resource. The value of my vote is going to be lower if you have a vote, if somebody else has a vote, right? Because maybe I would like my vote to, I'd like to use it to make the company do a particular thing, but if somebody else has a vote, they might be able to stop that happening. So votes are a scarce resource, and the value of your vote is greater the fewer other people have votes. So that sort of suggests that you've got to be rather careful about allocating them. They're really a scarce commodity, and like any scarce commodity, you've just got to try to allocate them to the group to whom they're most useful. So in economic terms. So if we think of those various groups that I talked about, let's just see which ones most need protection. So I would say, and I'm slightly changing the order here, but let's start off with consumers. So consumers care about what a firm does because consumers would like the firm to charge a low price. They'd like the product to be high quality, okay? So they certainly care. But they do have some action they can take if they're not happy, which is they can go to another firm. So, if you don't like the car that Fiat is supplying, you can go and get a car from Ford. Workers at the firm also care a lot about what the firm does, what wages it offers, what the conditions of work are, and this kind of thing. But they also have alternatives. If things get too bad, they can leave and get a job elsewhere. Now, of course, that can be quite costly, so I don't want to pretend that that's a trivial matter for a worker. But at least they have their human capital, which they have not given up to the firm, and they can take it somewhere else. Creditors, if a creditor is mistreated because the firm doesn't pay what it promised, then the creditor can do something about it. It can push the firm into bankruptcy, which is an unpleasant event for a firm. But shareholders, this is a group which is very, very unprotected. So if you think you're a shareholder, you've been promised a dividend because you handed over some money to the company or to somebody else, and you expect to get a dividend from the company. But now let's suppose that the managers decide not to pay any dividends, this year or maybe next year for a while, because they say, we need the money to carry out various investment projects. What can you do about it? If you don't forget votes, what happens if you don't have any votes? What can you do? The answer is nothing, because it wasn't a contractual promise, it was a discretionary payment. Now, people often say that, oh, yes, of course you could. Can you hear me all right? It's sort of slightly, it's okay. They say, oh, well, you can sell your shares. But this is really a fallacy, because, oh, yes, you can sell your shares, but who's going to buy them? Or to put it another way, how much will anyone pay for them if these are shares in a company that isn't going to be paying dividends? They're not going to be worth very much. So, effectively, shareholders are very vulnerable. They can be, in principle, expropriated completely. Now, this is where votes come in. If they have votes, they have some protection, because if the management or the board of directors is not acting in their interest, they can, in principle, do something about it. Now, it's not such an easy matter by any means, but they can try to vote them out, replace them with some group that is more sympathetic to them, or another thing they can do is maybe somebody will come along and try to make a bid for the company and for their shares, and they can sell their shares to this person, and since they have votes, let's say they have votes, the votes will then be assembled into a block by this bidder, and he or she can then use them to change the management of the board of directors of the company and start paying dividends. So I think at a first sort of cut of this, what the economics sort of tells us is that it's quite reasonable that the shareholders should have the votes, which is indeed very common. But we've said that we've got to that conclusion not by just saying that's the democratic way. Rather, we've said that they are useful to protect shareholders, and without such protection, shareholders may be unwilling to hand over their money in the first place. Now, the situation is not completely cut and dried or completely straightforward. In some situations, it may not be so important to have outside investors who have votes. Maybe the company doesn't need too much outside capital, and so you can afford to allocate the votes to some other group, because I didn't want to suggest that these other groups are completely protected. They're not. Let's take workers. If the company does something bad to them, it may be quite costly for them to find another job. And so some of their skills may be specific to this company. So, you know, there is also a case for giving them votes, and if the company doesn't need outside capital, maybe we might expect this to be efficient. And indeed, we see situations like this. Leading examples are professional partnerships. So, for example, consider a law firm. You might have a group of people who decide they want to set up a law firm. They're going to be partners in the firm. They have enough money themselves to set it up, and they care very much about how it's going to be run. So they want to control it. So the partners would have the votes. This is, in fact, what we see with law firm partnerships, and they won't have outside investors. They hold all the income claims themselves, and they also have the votes. And there are other examples like medical practices. You know, you have doctors who form a partnership, and they have the votes. They are the owners. So people often don't think of these as examples of worker-managed firms. You know, law firms, because we think of lawyers as being very rich and so on. But in fact, they are workers. They are working at their firms, and yet they also have the votes. They are also the owners. And then there are also other examples like this on the consumer side. So think of a group of people who would like to have a neighborhood swimming pool, and they might put the money down. They have enough money themselves to afford the pool. No, doesn't make sense for each of them to have their own pool, so they're going to share the pool. And what might be a good way of running that, of organizing the governance, the governing of that swimming pool? It might well be that they are all members of the pool and they have votes. They're also shareholders. They're member shareholders. So the shareholders of the pool are also the people who use the pool, who swim. who consume the product. So this is an example of a consumer cooperative, and there are lots of other examples around. Mutual insurance companies, daycare centers, some schools are like that. Now, typically these companies are small because they don't need much outside capital. They're not always small. There is a very well-known example of a large company that is a worker cooperative, worker managed, and that's Mondragon. But by and large, they're small because they have difficulty in raising capital. Because if they want to raise capital, either they have to get it from the workers or the consumers, whoever the owners are, or they have to go outside. But if they go outside, they face the problem I talked about earlier, that those people need protection. And so it makes sense actually to hand the votes to them and not to be a worker or consumer cooperative anymore. The point is that typically the workers or the consumers are not, or consumers are not in the best position to put up money for new investment. Either they don't have the money themselves, they don't have enough, or from the point of view of risk, they don't want to put all their wealth into the enterprise that they're working in or buying from. So so this is sort of the first part of my talk. The conclusion is that sometimes we're going to see companies which are not owned by their shareholders, or more precisely, their shareholders are also the workers or the consumers. But mostly for large companies, it's going to make sense to separate out the roles of being the investors in the company from being the consumers or the workers and the suppliers. And since you have a separate class of investors, because they're very unprotected, it makes sense to give them the votes. Okay. Now, in the second part of the talk, I want to focus on large companies where the votes are indeed in the hands of shareholders. So we might be thinking of Fiat or Intesa or Vodafone, companies like that. There's still an interesting question to be asked, which is how do you allocate the votes among the shareholders? So one possibility is that every share should have the same number of votes. Let's say each share gets one vote. So that's called a one share, one vote rule, and that's very common, particularly in the United States or the United Kingdom. It's less common in continental Europe, including Italy, where it's quite often the case that you see companies with more than one class of shares. So there might be two classes, and one class has more votes per share than the other class. So that's often called a dual class structure. It's a deviation from one share, one vote. And in fact, there has been recently in Europe a big debate about this. The European Union considered whether to make it mandatory for companies to have a one share, one vote rule, and they decided against it, against a mandatory rule. And we'll come back to that. I want to present two examples. I want to show you, again, I want to say that if you're thinking about democracy, what's democratic? We think in a case of a society, one person, one vote is democratic. Of course, people didn't always think that, right? They sometimes gave votes just to rich people. They gave votes to men and not women. They gave votes in the United States to whites and not blacks, and so on. So it's been a process, a very painful process, to reach one person, one vote. We think of that as democratic. But now, what does that mean in the case of shareholders? Should it be one share, one vote? Or one person, one shareholder, one vote? That actually is not seen much. But as I say, we sometimes see two classes of shares with different voting rights. So I'm going to give you an example first to show why it might be bad to have two classes, why one share, one vote might be economically efficient. So again, I want to make the point that economics can help. Just talking about what's democratic doesn't really tell you what's good, what's bad, but economics can tell us both what is sometimes good about one share, one vote, and what is sometimes bad about it. So let's start off with an example where we have a company which is, I may not be on the right page. Okay, I'm on the right page now. So this is a company that is currently being managed in such a way that it produces profits or dividends. Think of dividends. You know, people expect a stream of dividends over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And let's suppose the value of that dividend stream in current money is 100 euros, all right? So this is a rather small company. But you can think of, you know, multiply it by 1 billion, if you like. So let's suppose that this company has 100 shares, okay? So if the company's worth 100 euros, then each share is worth €1. And let's start off with the case where each share comes with 1 vote. All right, now I'm going to look at takeover bids. So in my analysis, 1 share, 1 vote will be good or bad because of the possibility of a takeover bid. So let's imagine someone wants to buy this company, and they're going to make a hostile takeover bid. They're not going to go through management. They're going to go straight to the shareholders. What would they have to do? Well, the natural thing is obviously to make an offer at more than €1 per share. It seems if they offer less than €1 per share, why should anybody sell their shares, since the shares are currently worth €1 each? So this would be an unattractive offer. You won't accept that. But if you're offered more than €1 per share, and it's the only offer on the table, and then the choice is each person can sell their share to this bidder or not, well, if they don't, you know, they want the bid to succeed because currently the shares are worth €1, and if the bidder loses, I'm going to assume that management continues, and so your shares will be worth €1. Someone's offering you more than that. It seems like an attractive idea, and so economic analysis, economic logic suggests that every shareholder will sell to the bidder, who will then accumulate all the shares, and since each share has a vote, the bidder will have all the votes and can vote out management and get control. Now, in a sense, well, in a very important sense, this is the right outcome because the company was worth €100. What we've concluded is someone can buy it for a bit over €100, and that means that if it's worth more to that person than €100, the sale will take place, and that's economically good because the value of the company will have gone up. You know, it's going to the person who values it most. And shareholder rights are fully protected because somebody cannot buy the company for less than it's worth. Okay, I'm assuming here that the bidder has to make an offer for all the shares. So that's what's good about 1 share, 1 vote. Now let's compare. Let's see what might happen if that company had a different voting structure. It had a dual class setup. So let's now change the facts a bit. Let's suppose that the company has 2 classes. Okay, Class A and Class B. Class A has 60 shares, each with 1 vote. And Class B has 40 shares, each with 2 votes. So this is now, we've got a class. The Class B is the superior voting class because it has 2 votes per share. But when I say Class A has 60 shares and Class B has 40 shares, what I mean by that is that when dividends are distributed, each shareholder gets the same amount, so that 60% of the dividends go to the Class A. So, you know, if €100 is distributed, each Class A shareholder gets €1, and each Class B shareholder gets €1. So 60% going to Class A, 40% going to Class B. So the dividends are distributed according to the number of shares you have, but if you're a Class B shareholder, you have more votes. Now, same situation where currently the company is worth €100. So this is what people expect in the form of dividends. So again, since the dividends are allocated pro rata to the shareholders, what this means, again, is that each share is worth €1. I want to now again consider how somebody could try to buy this company up. And what I want to argue is it's no longer necessary to offer more than €1 for every share in this company, because what you can do is just offer that deal to the Class B shareholders. So if you look at the numbers there, the Class B shareholders, if you just buy their shares, you're going to have 80 votes. 40 shares, 2 votes each, you'll get 80 votes, which means you have the majority of the votes, because the Class A only have 60. So you can get control. You don't have all the votes, but you have more than 50%. So you can vote out the board of directors and replace them with your own people. And you've done it just by buying the Class B shares. Now, so what I'm suggesting is that what you could do is just offer a little more than €1 to each of the Class B shareholders, and they will say to themselves, look, I'm being offered a good deal here. My shares are currently only worth €1. This person is offering me a little bit more. I'm going to sell. They all sell. The bidder has 80 votes, has control now. Now, what's happened to the Class A shareholders? This is the important point. They have not sold their shares because they weren't offered anything by the bidder. So let's just assume they carry on being shareholders in this company, which now has this bidder who controls it through his or her ownership of Class B. It could be that this new person who's going to replace management is actually less efficient at running the company. And so the Class A shareholders may find that their shares are worth less than €1 now. Just to give you an example, you might ask the following question. Why would someone who's less efficient bother to buy this company? And the answer is there are lots of reasons. So it could be that this person, again, I'm on the right one. Okay. This person might have what? The next one. All right. This one? No. Okay. All right. My Italian clearly needs to be improved. This person might have what we call in the business a private benefit. So I give you an example. This could be, let's suppose the company being purchased makes tires for cars, and the company that's bidding might be a car company. Now, I don't want to say any negative things about Fiat, so let's assume that it's General Motors. General Motors is going to buy this tire company, and their idea is once they've got control, they're going to sell tires to the parent company, to General Motors, at a low price. So that's a way, actually, of siphoning off the profit from the original company to General Motors. Now, if you are a Class A shareholder of the tire company, you're going to find that you're now an investor in a company that isn't making much money because it's selling its tires very cheaply to General Motors. Such things happen, and I think they happen in Italy quite a bit. Anyway, so this kind of, and it could be that General Motors could be quite a poor manager of the tire company, so they may actually be the wrong people to run it, but it's attractive to them because of the low price of tires. And what I'm saying is that they can get control by just buying 40% of the company and offering a nice deal to them and diluting the claims of the Class A shareholders. So this is an example. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this example is that under one share, one vote, this didn't happen because you had to buy everybody out and you had to make an attractive offer, so you couldn't dilute the shareholders. But once you have two classes, you can play them off against each other. Basically, you make an offer to the class with most of the votes, and you may hurt the other class, but there's nothing they can do about it. Okay, so here one share, one vote is good. But this is not always the case. So I now want to change the example to show you that sometimes one share, one vote may be bad. So life is difficult. We can't, there's no simple result, this is always good, this is always bad. It depends on the circumstances. So let's consider the same setup of a company which is currently worth 100 euros, but I want to suppose it's no longer a tire company. Let's assume it's a newspaper. It could be a newspaper company. It could be the New York Times, okay? The New York Times produces a pretty good newspaper. It's quite high quality. It is informative. There's a lot about politics. It could be said to educate a certain section of the American public. And let's suppose it's running along and it's worth 100 euros. Now, someone might have the idea that the New York Times should be changed in such a way to make it more popular. So I don't know what its readership, let's say it's 1 million now, but you could make it perhaps have 5 million people buy it if you made it a little less sophisticated. So perhaps we should have more pages on gossip, gossip columns, or perhaps interviews with film stars, more interviews with film stars or models or this kind of thing, and you could make the New York Times more profitable. Now, so here's an example where somebody with that idea might come along and offer the shareholders, let's suppose that currently it's a one share, one vote company. So there are a lot of shareholders, there are 100 shareholders, each share has one vote. Somebody could offer a little more than €1 to each of the shareholders, and they will think to themselves, well, currently my share's worth €1, someone's offering me more. I care a little bit about the New York Times, but maybe I don't even read it. I'm an investor in it, but I don't actually read it myself. It would be a little sad if it disappeared, but you know what? I also care about money. I fear people do think that way. So this bid, maybe the person would have to offer, €1.50 to get their shares, but it's kind of attractive because they're going to make money by selling their shares to this outsider who gets control and changes the New York Times. And in my example, I want you to think that the New York Times was really creating some value for society, which wasn't reflected in the share price. So I was saying it does a good job of educating people and telling people about politics. So you can imagine it sort of improves the way the US is governed, because people are more educated and know which politicians to vote for and this kind of thing. So once someone gets control and changes it, that's lost. That social benefit is lost. And yet, in what I want to say in that example is, it might be in the interest of any one shareholder to sell to the bidder, particularly if, by the way, the bidder says, my bid is unconditional. So, I might say to myself, I hope the other people don't sell, but I'm going to sell for €1.50 because this bidder has promised to pay me that even if his bid fails. So then that's a way of really putting the pressure on people to kind of be self-interested in self. So, okay, so I claim that when a company creates social value, that wasn't true in the previous example, one share, one vote may not be so good, because yes, it protects the private interests of the shareholders, but it encourages them perhaps to ignore the social interest. Now, let me go back to, suppose this company had two classes of shares, Class A and Class B. Same numbers as before. The Class B shares have, there are 40 of them, they have 2 votes each. One could imagine that maybe those shares, the superior voting shares, were owned by a family. Maybe the family that set up the New York Times. Well, there is such a family, the Sulzberger family, and indeed, the New York Times is a company with 2 classes of stock. And the Sulzbergers own the, I think it's the right family, they own the superior voting stock, and they're often under pressure to move to one share, one vote. In fact, right now there's a campaign, or at least last year there was a campaign, I think it failed, because of course they decide and they didn't want to give up their control. Why should they? But the point is that if they own, if this family owns the Class B, they can just say no. Because the bidder, even if he got all the Class A shares, that would only be 60 votes. The family has 80 votes. So they can veto the sale of the company to someone who's going to make it a more popular and less educational newspaper. And in my example, that might be a good thing, because this company is creating a social benefit, one that the family cares about, but the ordinary investors don't care about quite so much. Now, this is very topical, not only with respect to the New York Times, but also the Wall Street Journal. So some of you may have followed that in the last few months, or a little longer now, I suppose. I mean, Rupert Murdoch wanted to buy the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal actually was family-owned. The Bancroft family owned the Wall Street Journal, and there were two classes of stock. They had the superior voting stock, and they had enough votes to reject his offer. Now, it turns out they didn't. They accepted it, and one of the things that was going on is that the Bancroft family is quite dispersed now. So although it perhaps once upon a time was a close-knit family, it isn't anymore, and there were some people who wanted to get out. They wanted money. They didn't care so much about the Wall Street Journal. Rupert Murdoch promised that he wouldn't change the Wall Street Journal too much, and indeed he said he would respect editorial independence, and don't worry, the editor can do whatever he likes. And I think about 4 months later, the editor was fired, which is quite surprising, really, to everybody except those who know Rupert Murdoch. But the Bancrofts, obviously, had decided not to worry too much about that. Okay, so they could have stopped it, but they chose not to. All right, I'm going to conclude by... was this the conclusion? No. Yes. All right. So the last bit is, in a way, a little more light-hearted, because it's, we move away from firms to politics, which is always more amusing. So I just want to say we can use these kinds of ideas about what's good or bad about one vote. And in particular, I want to think about what's good about it. The first example, we can apply that to the following question. Would it be a good idea in political elections to allow people to buy and sell votes? So this is far-fetched, a bit far-fetched, which is why this is a little more humorous, but it is sometimes suggested. You sometimes hear people saying, you know, markets for everything. You know, we can buy, why shouldn't we buy and sell everything? Kidneys, votes. Let's have votes. Why not? Well, let's see. Let's try to understand whether that would be a good idea. So essentially what I want to argue is the following. Let's take an example. Let's think about the American election, presidential election, which is coming up, and let's imagine that Barack Obama wins the Democratic nomination, and that then McCain, John McCain, you know, who's kind of a bit old, gets very tired and can't run in the fall. So instead, you know, he drops out, and instead a third-party candidate emerges, and let's suppose it's Ross Perot. Now, you may remember, Ross Perot is the man who ran as a third-party candidate in the United States in 1992. He's extremely wealthy. So let's suppose he decided this was his opportunity to try again, and we were in a situation where we had a market for votes. People could buy and sell votes. Then I would claim that the following might well happen. So I'm going to assume that somehow Barack Obama would be a better president than Ross Perot. But I want to assume that if there was just a vote between them, Barack Obama would win. But I want to claim that if you can buy and sell votes, then Ross Perot is probably going to win. And the reason is that he's much, much richer than, I assume he still is, than Barack Obama. And so what he could do is he could offer each of us, actually I'm not an American citizen at this point, so I can't vote. But let's suppose I am trying to become one, so I might be able to vote by then. So he might offer me something for my vote. Now I might, and everybody else, and people like me, I might think the following. I might think, well, I don't want him to win, but on the other hand, my vote, if he buys my vote, it's not going to affect the outcome, my vote. And he's offering me something he's offering me more than Barack Obama is offering me, because he's so much richer, he can afford it. And so I might be tempted to sell my vote to him, sort of hoping that everybody else doesn't. And certainly if everybody else does as I am doing, then I certainly should sell. I may as well make money, you know. But either way, really, it makes sense for me to sell to Ross Perot because I'm extremely unlikely to be pivotal, my vote, my little vote. And the trouble is, if everybody reasons that way, we all sell our votes to Ross Perot, and he votes himself the President of the United States, even though it could be a very bad outcome. And the reason, of course, he's willing to do that is this private benefit. He may even think that he's a worse president, although he probably doesn't, but it may just be so wonderful to be President of the United States that he's willing to pay for it. So this, I think, is what is wrong with having a market for votes in politics. And what's really going on here, to connect this to my example of one share, one vote, is it's really like having, if you have a market for votes, you've created sort of dual class, a dual class structure, because the people, the shareholders, the people who are receiving the dividends are the citizens of the United States. They can't sell that income stream. Those are the benefits or the costs from living in the United States. And the only way you could get rid of that is to leave the country. Even then, of course, you're living in the world, and so you're going to be affected by what the United States does. But the point is that if you like, the income claims or the dividend streams are inalienable when it comes to politics. The only thing that can be sold is the votes. But we saw why, at least in my first example, it was quite dangerous to separate, or could be, my General Motors example, it was dangerous to separate the votes from the income claims. You want to bundle them together, and a one-person, one-vote rule in politics makes sure that they are bundled together. Okay, let me then conclude by saying that, just to summarize the talk then, I started off by saying that you've got these different groups of stakeholders, you've got this scarce resource, votes, you want to allocate them to the group that needs the most protection, and I think that is, there's a very strong argument that that is shareholders, the people who hand over their money and just promise something vague in return. But sometimes, when a company doesn't need outside investors, makes sense to have those shareholders also have another role in the firm, such as being the workers or the consumers. So to bundle together those who hold the profit claims and those who are doing something else. And this will be true of companies that don't need a lot of outside capital, and there are plenty of examples of that around, worker or consumer cooperatives. And I gave the example of law firms or swimming clubs or tennis clubs or this kind of thing. So one conclusion is that, you know, it all depends. There isn't a single best way of running a company. You're going to see different types of companies around, and indeed we do see that. Then there was the question of, in a large company where, because it needs lots of capital, it's decided to allocate the votes to the shareholders, and the workers and the consumers are separate groups. Then the question is, do you want one share, one vote, or something more complicated? And the answer is, sometimes you want one share, one vote, but not always. We saw in my example of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, it could be helpful to have family ownership and control, which can be facilitated through dual class. So one size does not fit all. You expect to see different kinds of companies with different voting structures out there, and probably therefore the answer is not to have mandatory rules about how you should design your company, but let people choose. If you want to set up a family newspaper, and you want to retain control, that's up to you. Another recent example is Google. Google, for some reason, I'm not sure it's such a good idea for them, but they decided, the founders of Google decided when they went public that they wanted to retain control. So they had a superior voting class, which they hold. Now, I don't think it's a particularly good idea for them, but it's their choice. Presumably, the people who bought the shares should have bought them at a bit of a discount because they know that the management team is entrenched. On the other hand, since everyone thinks they're geniuses, of the first order, no one seems to care, perhaps, at this point. But they may care in the future, when perhaps it turns out they aren't so amazing at everything. But okay, so recently, I mentioned this, the European Union considered whether to have a mandatory one share, one vote rule for public companies in Europe and decided against it. And I think that's probably wise, because we've seen it's not always a good thing. Let people do what they want. And it may well be over time that many companies of their own accord gravitate towards a one share, one vote rule because it's sort of relatively efficient, but we should let them make that decision themselves. Okay, with that I stop.
Ma dunque, intanto no, volevo solo dire che a proposito del sistema.
Well, with reference to the one vote, one share system mentioned by Professor Hart, and just to adapt it to our capitalism, I remember what Enrico Cuccia said. Shares should not be counted, they should be weighed. And this is a philosophy which has dominated large industrial groups for many years. And then I remember how important syndicate agreements are. And I know that there are many large groups which are controlled by a limited number of shares. Well, these are some points which I would like to offer to the audience for a debate. So these are comments about our Italian system, which has some abnormalities as compared to the systems which have just been described. So I would say that we can open the debate. If you have any questions or comments to make, please go ahead and use the microphone, please.
Parlo in italiano perché il mio inglese ormai è arrugginito. Si sente? No? E allora.
Well, thank you very much for this very brilliant contribution. But if you allow me, Professor, there was an obstacle that was not duly considered. I'm talking on behalf of the small Italian shareholder. And since we're talking about democracy, I would like to say that in public company shareholders meetings, there is no democracy at all. In Italy, as we've heard from Mr. Perini, in Italy, there are big groups that do actually control companies. This may be a de facto situation or an official one. One of the most important Italian banks has recently approved the balance sheet with little more than the representation of 20% of the equity shareholders. When you go to the general assemblies of Italian companies, well, you see 20, 30 people there, you know, and sometimes, like in the Eni assemblies, shareholders do not even have the right to reply to what is being told to them. So the vote of small shareholders is equal to 0. So, Professor Hart, which is your opinion regarding this totally anomalous situation, and which remedies would you suggest? Thank you very much.
This is a very good question, and I don't disagree at all with the tone of the question. It turns out that Italy isn't very different from the United States in this regard. I mean, I read about shareholder meetings in the United States. They're very undemocratic, often. Some of them have been extremely short. And important people from the company didn't appear. I think it was it Home Depot? There was some company, I think it was, where there was a lot of criticism of chief executive pay, and they basically, management has a great deal of ability to organize the meeting as they wish. This is in the United States, and they did it in such a way that shareholders couldn't really complain. I think, as I say, it was an extreme 20-minute meeting or something. So I don't want to pretend for a moment that what we have now under one share, one vote is democratic in the way we want. In fact, I think, and again, I know more about the US than Italy, but I'm sure, you describe it as being bad in Italy, but I just want to say that most shareholders in the US do nothing. They don't pay attention to what's going on. And it's not unreasonable because, you get stuff in the mail and, you're busy. Your vote isn't going to matter. You're asked to vote for some board. You're just approving. There's no contest usually. And so you don't even bother to really think about the issues. And in addition, if you go to the meeting, which is presumably, could be 3,000 miles away, you're going to just be one small person and they may not even call upon you or whatever. I think I think a lot can and should be improved there, but it is happening. Actually, there are some encouraging signs because in the last few years in the US, shareholders have begun to become more active. And there's now a kind of movement, beginnings of a movement. There's a lot of bad publicity, in the newspapers for people who, I suppose the big issue, one of the big issues has been CEO compensation. So, there's been so much criticism of that, that CEOs who previously didn't have to worry about shareholder reaction now have to worry a lot, and they also have to worry about press reaction. But in addition to that, there have been calls for boards to pay more attention to what shareholders want, to the motions they pass, or to make it easier for them to select an alternative board. So there have been all sorts of proposals to make it possible for a small shareholder, or not so small, but not so big either, to put up an alternative slate of directors to compete against the incumbent board. That used to be extremely difficult, and it's still very difficult. And I'm not sure, most of the proposals haven't been implemented, which I think is bad news. But the good news is that there's been a lot of discussion about it and a lot of press coverage, and so companies are being forced to pay more attention to their shareholders. They can't get away anymore with just ignoring them. A current example, which I think is very interesting, is what's happening with Yahoo, which, as you may have read, turned down an offer by Microsoft, and some of the shareholders of Yahoo are very unhappy about it. And led by Carl Icahn, who is the kind of person who takes stakes in companies. So sometimes he makes a takeover bid, sometimes he just acquires a significant shareholding, and then he tries to change what management does. Well, he has announced that he's going to put up a competing slate for the board of directors. So there's going to be an election every year. Yahoo has an election for the board, and normally there's no contest. But this year, there's going to be a competing slate. I hope I'm using the word slate. It's a group, so 10, 12 people, whatever. Management have the 12 people they want to be elected, and Carl Icahn has another group, which includes my colleague Lucian Bebchuk, actually at Harvard Law School. So shareholders this time will have a chance to vote, and there's been such a lot of discussion of this in the media that maybe they'll vote for Carl Icahn, hoping that he's going to start talks with Microsoft again. So these are all signs, I think, that over time, my view is a lot needs to be done. There have been lots of abuse of shareholders, of small shareholders, by companies not just in Italy, but in the US. I think the UK is a bit better. But these things can change. It's evolving, and I think we just have to try to push more in that direction. So rather a lengthy answer, but a very good question.
You have suggested also the hypothesis of selling a political vote. I believe that such a hypothesis would be a complete disaster for democracy. You gave us the example of Ross Perot buying votes to become the president. I mean, Ross Perot is certainly better off than Mr. Obama. So he buys the votes at the next American elections and is elected president of the United States. Well, selling a share of a company actually does mean selling a vote. However, in the political scenario, this cannot be allowed. The political vote cannot be sold. Otherwise, it would be a dictatorship. This actually may happen in some situations, but we cannot legitimize it.
That was really my point. That was the point I was trying to make. So I totally agree with you. But that was the purpose of my example, was to say that politics is different from the firm. I mean, the political situation is different because in the firm, if someone buys the company, he or she is buying the shares, the income claims, along with the votes. Particularly if you have one share, one vote, when I buy your vote, I'm also buying your interest in the company. In the political context, we can't do that, because if I live in the United States, you can't buy my community interest in the United States. I'm a citizen there. So all you can do is buy my vote, and I argued that's very bad. So the whole point of my example of Ross Perot was to make exactly the point you've made. I think it would be a bad thing. I'm against it. But I'm not against buying shares and votes in the corporate context.
I'm not an economist, I'm a political scientist. But I wondered if I could push this asymmetry between companies and voting constituencies a bit further on the issue of these companies with dual-tiered stock. Doesn't this signal that there's some overriding private or public benefit, that good, that's being protected here? Now, in the case of the Financial Times, it might be intellectual capital, as in the case of, or an educational function. Intellectual capital in the case of Google. In the case of Fiat, for instance, it could be not only a family interest, but a desire to keep the company in Italy and not sell out to a multinational. I wonder if this is something that, this depends always on a value judgment. Even, after all, the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times are in the same universe of companies. It's only a question about how they're going to be managed that makes a difference. Is there a way that economists try to measure this public or private good? Or is it simply another way of saying that the asymmetry between companies and constituencies means we should be cautious about recommending one person, one vote in the case of companies?
You mean one share, one vote?
Yeah.
One share. I think, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I think it's hard to measure the social value. It's not impossible. You could try to measure how much people are getting from the New York Times, say, or the Financial Times, or whatever it is, over and above how much they have to pay. There are some techniques for doing that. I mean, you could, one thing you could do is you could ask them, you know, you could ask an individual how much, you know, would you be willing to pay each day for this? You know, you have to make it clear to them they won't have to actually pay it, but, you know, they only pay $1.25 to the New York Times, whatever the FT costs these days. But, you know, they might indicate to you that actually it's much more valuable to that than to them than that. But I think, so you could try to do it, but I think the more important message of the economic analysis and of my talk is that it's really pretty much up to the people who set these things up to decide how important it is to them. So, you know, it could well be that when you set up, let's take Google, because it's a recent example. I assume that the managers, Brin and the other guy, I'm very bad on people's names, but those people who set it up, who founded it, for some reason, because they have this view of the Google way of life, they wanted to protect that, and they thought the best way to do it would be for them to have control and not to allow some external person to buy up the company. Now, the counter argument would be that if they're running the company well, the shares would be so expensive, which, by the way, they are now, that nobody in their right mind would try to take it over because, you know, you'd have to pay a huge amount for it. And, you know, if Rupert Murdoch tried to take over Google, you know, my assumption is that once he got control, some key people would leave, and he would find that the Google magic was disappeared, and he would be left holding something which was much less valuable. He would have spent a huge amount for something which is no longer so valuable under his ownership or management. He's not stupid. In fact, far from it. So he wouldn't do that. And so that's actually the usual argument, that if you're running a company well, you don't need special protection. But obviously they didn't think that was good enough, perhaps in the future. And I think it was their right. You have to say to them, if that's the way you want to, you know, if you want to sell off shares to the public with lower voting rights, fine, they know what they're getting. They'll pay accordingly for it. But it's really up to the people who set up the company, as opposed to society to say, no, you should have set it up another way, or you can't set it up that way. Freedom of contract, I think, is the lesson here, the message.
Thanks. Whenever the number of votes is large enough, it seems to me that the probability that your single vote is pivotal is essentially negligible.
Yes.
And therefore, by exactly the same argument that you outlined before, the vote is going to be driven by any small private benefit you might draw out of it. So I'm wondering whether this kind of mechanism is not a kind of indictment of the voting mechanism as a way to generate efficient results.
Well, I think there are 2 points here. The first is that when it comes to contests for control and people actually making bids for the company, takeover bids, then suddenly those votes actually become valuable because you have one person who's trying to buy them and they want 50% of them. They're no longer negligible. And so particularly if you have a contest between two people. So let's just imagine, let's go back to my political example, even though I don't want to claim this is not the way we should do things. But suppose we did have candidates could buy votes, and suppose we had Ross Perot against Barack Obama, then they'd both be bidding for votes, there'd be a market for them, and there would be a price, and you could sell to the highest bidder, and you get some money out of it, because even though your vote is negligible, the person who's assembling the two competing teams, for them, every vote matters, because they're trying to get more than the competitor. So we do indeed see that when there are contests for control, and you have two classes of shares, the class with the more votes per share sells at a premium. In fact, it sometimes sells at a premium in anticipation of a control contest. So that's the sense in which it's not negligible anymore. Now, when it comes to actually voting in a board election, there is indeed a problem. So, if we go back to the Yahoo example, there's going to be an election for the board, I think at the end of July, and you have these two competing teams, the incumbent team and then the team led by Carl Icahn, and people are going to have to decide how to vote, and they could quite rationally decide not to bother. However, I think because there's been a lot of publicity, and people may believe that with one team their company is going to be more valuable, they may decide, you know, it's worth it this time. I will check the box or send in the email or whatever is required, go to the website. It only takes a few minutes. So it's not very costly to do it. And so when you know, the benefit may be enough to them, or they just are interested or something. It's the same thing with national elections. For economists, Alan Kruger was talking about this yesterday. There is a bit of a mystery as to why people vote, and then some of them take it very seriously, even though their vote is very unlikely to matter. Although, of course, elections have been getting closer and closer, and so people now feel, well, actually, I might make the difference. But even when that wasn't happening, people vote. I think the reason they vote, even though it probably doesn't matter, is because they think it's an important civil sort of duty to vote, most people. Of course, not enough people vote. But so the answer to your question is sort of yes and no. In some cases, in some situations, it's negligible. But even if it is, if the issue is important enough and the cost of voting isn't very great, people may still do it.
I come from Germany, and you certainly know that in our country, co-determination plays an important role. When it was introduced, many people argued that this will be very disadvantageous for Germany because the rights of the shareholders will be reduced. I cannot see that it was a big disadvantage for Germany and for the development of the German economy that they have introduced this co-determination. Do you have an explanation why it is, in this case, or it has not been so disadvantage as some people assumed it would be?
It's a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer because I don't know enough about the German situation. I'm aware of what you're describing. We probably would need to have some German expert here, maybe you are such a person, who could say either yes, that's right, or no, actually, it hasn't been as good. I mean, some German companies have certainly made mistakes, but it's probably not because of that. You know, I'm thinking of Daimler-Benz buying Chrysler, which seemed to be a disaster, but I'm sure it's not because of that. All I can say is, you know, it's a fact that people adjust to things, and many things that might not be a particularly good idea if they're implemented turn out not to be as bad as was feared, or people find a way around it. But I have to say that if somebody had come to me and said, is this a good idea, I would say no. And I would say, you know, if a company might decide of its own accord that it would be good to have workers on the board, they might, or union representatives or whoever it is, or they might decide to have, I think it's a two-board, is it a two-board structure? It's a complicated thing, but they could have done that voluntarily if it had been efficient. They didn't. And by the way, one thing which I think is worth noting is it's not as if sometimes people haven't thought of something, and it may be actually good, and it may be people are required to do it, and they think, you know what, this was a very good idea. But if that was the case, we would expect to see companies in other countries imitating the German model, which we have not seen. So my guess is that it may not have been as bad as people feared, but it probably hasn't been very good. But I cannot back that up. So it's a very good question, and I'd like to know more about it.
Altre domande? Sì.
Al principio, un'azione, un voto, laddove si vuole aumentare il peso specifico di determinati...
The principle one chair, one vote in those cases in which you want to increase the weight of specific stakeholders, well, there are some possibilities, such as the cooperative form, where we have the personal principle, not the proprietary principle, so that we have one individual, one head, one vote. And thereby you can ascribe a different weight to the different shareholders. However, if you have a high number of shareholders, the system does not work, and you cannot oblige anybody to participate in the actions. The shareholders cannot be obliged to take part, to participate in the assembly. So in this given situation, how significant is control? I mean, for those who do not want to participate, and for those who participate knowing that their vote is not determinant, well, usually they rely on an efficient system to control the company, such as the one carried out by CONSOB, the equivalent of the American ICC, by the Bank of Italy, by independent bodies, antitrust institutes, and so on and so forth. So we have the impression that the big financial scandals of the last few years were due to the fact that the general interest of big companies should pursue was not sufficiently safeguarded by those who could have done it via these controlling mechanisms. And as a matter of fact, also in politics, those who do not vote and those who vote knowing that their vote is not determinant do not feel sufficiently safeguarded by those who should actually check and control politicians' activities. I mean, we have some constitutional measures to check how the parliament is working. We have the magistrates. We have some forms of administrative controls. Well, we have the impression that this controlling system is not very efficient and effective. What do you think of this?
Well, I think a lot of this could be summarized by, I think it was Winston Churchill who said democracy is the worst system that we have except for everything else. And this is roughly what I feel about this. So allocating votes to shareholders or whoever, if you want to decide you're going to have a consumer cooperative, that's up to you, and sometimes, as I've explained, that might be a good idea. But it may not work that well. So several people have raised important, very valid questions about this. When you have large numbers of people, there are collective action problems. Economists are very well aware of this, and we all know that people are passive and may not bother too much about what management is doing, and so on and so forth. But there's no magic cure to this. All you can do is try to set things up to minimize this. Now, one of the things which is actually good about companies is, and I know this is a controversial position, but it's been implicit in my talk, and let me make it more explicit. The possibility of somebody making a bid for a company is that's a very powerful mechanism and a very powerful constraint on management, because management might be kind of confident that with all these little shareholders, you know, they're all asleep, they've got jobs, they're not paying much attention to the company because they're all negligible. But the whole point that somebody can come along and make a bid for the company and turn it in, if it's being badly run it properly and make a lot of money out of that because they'll now be a big shareholder. That is a powerful incentive for outsiders to kind of monitor companies. Now, companies are at an advantage there relative to political societies. You can't do that with a society, right? We don't, and it's very similar to the discussion we were having about vote buying. You could, if you had vote buying and selling, you could imagine, you know, somebody who didn't like the way America was being run, and there are many such people right now, could make a bid for America. They would just go, it doesn't have to be Ross Perot, it could be Osama bin Laden, actually, he's also a rich person, could go and launch a hostile bid and buy up the votes of American citizens and make himself president. Now, for the reasons we've been talking about, that would be a very bad idea to have such a mechanism, because the person isn't buying the income claims along with the votes. They're just buying the votes, so they could do an enormous amount of damage. So this mechanism is not available in society. So in politics, we have to rely on other mechanisms like the press. So people are less apathetic and more inclined to vote because there are lots of stories about the candidates and everybody feels excited about the election in a way that they don't about a typical corporate election, which is very, very boring. So in the corporate context, we have hostile takeover bids instead. These are, let's not forget, so one point is we shouldn't forget hostile takeover bids. For the corporate context, they'd be a bad idea for the political context. But the other thing is, life is highly imperfect, and we're just trying to find the best sort of imperfect solution.
Altre domande?
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much, Professor Hart. And we can conclude our conference here.